July 6, 1941. A dirt road out of Khmelnytsky, Ukraine. The air heavy with the smell of engine oil, gun grease, and cold metal. Snow from a late spring thaw clung to the rutted tracks. A gray sky pressed low. Lieutenant Mikhail Petrov stood on the flank of a column, cap pulled down, breath steaming as he watched the first batch of new tanks trundle by. The T-34s were not graceful. They looked, at a distance, like something cobbled together in a farmhouse. Blunt noses, squat silhouettes, and seams that ran like hurried stitches through steel. "Well, look at that welding," Petrov muttered to Sergeant Ivan Karpov, who had spent 6 years as a mechanic on BT light tanks. Karpov leaned in, fingers picking at a rough bead on the glacis plate, as if the metal might unravel. "Crude," he said. "Misshapen. No fine finish. Practically welded by blacksmiths?" Petrov had orders to watch them, to understand them. He had seen the drawings. Sloped armor, a new Christie suspension, a 76.2mm gun that promised more than the old F-34s. But on the ground up close, the T-34's simplicity offended the eye trained on precision. Officers whispered criticisms, optics crude as a peasant's spyglass, brass fittings that rattled, periscopes that threw a blurred world. Captain Yuri Sokolov, a tactician with a taste for German engineering, laughed aloud when the commander of the new tank, Lieutenant Alexander Morozov, described the design. "We need finesse in sight, not brute force with poor sight," Sokolov said, clapping Morozov on the shoulder as if to test the steadiness of a new recruit. Morozov's crew, a driver named Pavel, a loader nicknamed Fedya, and a young radio operator, Nikolai, made do. They carried extra lens cloths in a patched canvas. Baggin swore under their breath. When the periscope fogged up, Fedya joked that the commander's hatch looked like a coal scuttle. Pavel, who had driven faster and lighter machines, complained about cramped space and the heavy clutch. Yet when the tank growled, when the diesel V2 caught, and the transmission engaged with a shudder, a different look passed across their faces. A raw, private satisfaction that had nothing to do with polish. They called it simple, the way men call hard bread plain, as if plain could not also be the most filling thing. In a lean winter, but words edge toward contempt when confidence is thin. Lieutenant Petrov had heard older officers brag about welded armor that glittered under inspection lamps, about optics lined with nickel and glass. These T-34s offered a different truth. The seams were visible because speed and quantity mattered. The optics were spare because the factory had been given one job: build tanks until the very maps changed. At dusk, the convoy halted in a wash of mud and smoke. Men unrolled rations and set up shivering stoves. The T-34s settled on their torsos of track, each one breathing like a sleeping beast. Petrov walked to Morozov's vehicle out of habit, and because the lieutenant had a way of seeing things that others pretended not to. Through a half-open crew hatch, he caught a glimpse of the turret ring, workmanlike, painted hastily but greased properly. Morozov caught his look and shrugged. "We were short of optics during trials," Morozov said, voice a whisper among clinks of mess tin. "But we have weight where it counts. The slope, do you feel how it sits? It is not like the old boxes." Petrov pressed his hand against cold steel and felt the subtle curve of the glacis. Sloped, indeed. The plates met at angles that threw evening light sideways. It was a geometric answer to a problem older than tactics. How to make less metal stop the same blow. He had read the reports, in small print, that a sloped surface might deflect a projectile, that effective thickness increased with angle. Yet in the mud and the whispering, where men measured machines by the comfort of their cups and the sharpness of their sights, theory was a thing to be proven in lead and shrapnel. That proof would not come quietly. The next morning, as gray turned to a brittle kind of cold and the convoy moved toward the front, the column met the roar for which every soldier prays and fears. A scouting party had reported German armored cars probing the highway, light vehicles, but backed by something heavier. The first shots cracked like thunder, and the world narrowed to the smell of cordite in the metallic. Scream of spinning shells. Petrov watched from behind a stump as Morozov's T-34 uncoiled its engine and angled across the road, tracks crunching rubble, turret turning like a slow, deliberate eye. The German 37mm rounds began to come in, thin, sharp, designed to find vulnerabilities. They struck the T-34's slope front and, in 3 terrible, miraculous moments, slid off as if denied by a door. Sparks flew, metal shivered. Morozov's crew heard the impacts, the percussion of enemy hope, and did not flinch. They returned a single steady burst from their 76.2, catching a German reconnaissance car broadside. The car shuddered, then folded. Around the stump, the older officers who had mocked the welding shifted like men who have been pushed into new weather. Karpov swore, not from anger, but from surprise. It bounced, he said. He touched the ground as if to pin the fact down. The optics had been poor. The shots had still come home. The T-34's crude seams and blunt edges had just refused to obey the old rules. On the road, as smoke lifted and a silence settled like a verdict, A new sound rose from the T-34's crew, laughter that tasted of adrenaline and awe. Morozov tapped the radio, reporting simply, "Target destroyed, systems functioning." The message was spare, like the tank itself. Lieutenant Petrov wiped his hands and, for the first time that morning, felt the weight of his initial judgment slide into a different space. Not comfort, nor triumph, but a cold, clear respect. The tank that had arrived clothed in contempt had proved something that could not be argued away with neat optics and polished seams. It had begun to outlive the assumptions that made men comfortable. Dawn had barely cleared the tree line when the order rippled down the column. The Germans were pushing harder, not probing now, but advancing. A full armored spearhead driving toward Berdihiv. Lieutenant Petrov mounted the side rail of Morozov's T-34 as runners sprinted between machines. Diesel engines grumbled awake, coughing smoke that mixed with morning fog. The forest smelled of wet bark, oil, and the sour tang of fear. By 7:40, the battalion rolled into a shallow valley where farms once stood. Now the fields were blackened, littered with half-buried wagons and the carcasses of horses stiffening in the frost. The horizon trembled. Panzer IIIs and IVs appeared in the distance, their columns neat, their engines a polished chorus. The Germans moved like clockwork, each vehicle maintaining perfect spacing, turrets swiveling with cold precision. To Soviet eyes accustomed to crude welds and stripped-down optics, the German tanks looked like a different species. Cleaner lines, tighter seams, smarter silhouettes. Captain Sokolov muttered, "This is what engineering looks like," as if the machines themselves had marched from some immaculate factory untouched by war. Petrov heard him, but kept his gaze on the T-34s forming a defensive line ahead. Morozov's tank halted on a rise. Pavel braked hard, throwing mud over the hull. "We hold here!" Morozov barked into the turret. Fedya slammed shells into the rack. Nikolai adjusted the newly mounted 71 TK1 radio, swearing when the dial stuck. The periscope fogged again, and Morozov wiped it with his sleeve, cursing softly. No one cared any more that the optics were simple, not when the sky flashed with muzzle fire. The first Panzer salvos came like hammer strikes. Their rounds hit the earth around the T-34s, geysers of soil erupting in arcs. A single German shell struck Morozov's glacis plate at a shallow angle. The impact rang like a cathedral bell. Inside, the crew felt the vibration pass through their bones. The shell skidded off, spiraling into a fallow field. Fedya grinned through clenched teeth. "She shrugs it off," he said. Petrov lay prone beside the rise, binoculars pressed to his face. He watched a Panzer III angle toward a nearby T-34, Lieutenant Gribov's vehicle, and fire twice. Both rounds deflected off the sloped armor. Gribov's turret turned a fraction too slow. His shot went wide, kicking up dust near the Panzer's treads. Petrov whispered, "Come on, adjust," and felt the seconds stretch into a wire. The Panzer fired again, a dull flash and a streak of smoke. Gribov's tank rocked, a hit, but not a penetration. The T-34's armor had held again, though the blow left a crater of peeled steel on the turret's side. Gribov's loader rammed a new shell home. The F-34 gun roared. And this time, the round punched through the Panzer's frontal plate. Flames blossomed from the hatch. The German crew bailed out, silhouettes stumbling like men running through a bad dream. Further down the line, an entire company of T-34s began to advance. Not gracefully, not with clean formation, but with the brute confidence of machines built to ignore the rules. Tracks churned mud into a storm. Their guns boomed in mismatched rhythm, like improvised drums in a factory yard. The Germans adjusted, they always did, but something was wrong in their reaction. The 37 Ewin of 50-meter guns that had cracked open. French and Polish armor were failing here. Their rounds struck angles that denied them. Panzer IVs, with their short-barreled 75s, tried to compensate. Their shells hit with heavier impact, shaking T-34s to their bolts. One T-34 lost a track and spun helplessly. Smoke poured from the engine compartment, but the crew bailed out alive, sprinting toward a ditch as machine gun fire followed them. Petrov saw something shift among the Germans, a break in their disciplined lines, hesitation, the kind of hesitation that spreads like frost. He turned to Sokolov, who was watching the battle wide-eyed. "Your engineering," Petrov said without spite, "is burning." Sokolov did not answer. Not everything favored the Soviets. One T-34 hit a concealed trench. Its nose plunged, turret jamming against the earth. The Germans concentrated fire, hammering it with repeated strikes until flames licked from the hatch. The crew never escaped. The loss hit the line like a gut punch. For all its strength, the T-34 was still mortal. But the battalion did not falter. Morozov's tank crested the rise, Pavel gunning the engine as Fedya fired shell after shell. They scored a hit on a Panzer IV's turret ring, sending it spinning like a broken toy. Morozov's voice over the internal intercom was calm, steady, almost eerily so. "Targets forward. Maintain spacing. Do not let them flank." The Germans began pulling back. Not a rout, but a controlled, uneasy withdrawal. Their tanks reversed behind a screen of smoke. The Soviet line advanced, clumsy yet unstoppable. The field was a graveyard of burning vehicles, both Soviet and German, but the fact could not be ignored. The T-34s had held. They had endured the storm. As the last Panzer vanished into the haze, Morozov climbed out of his hatch. His face was blackened with soot. His eyes shone with something like vindication. Petrov approached him across ground littered with shrapnel and steaming debris. Neither spoke at first. They simply listened to the ticking engines, the soft crackle of flames, and the ragged breaths of men who had found new faith in steel. Only then did Morozov say, voice hoarse, "They may mock the seams, they may mock the optics. Let them. This machine, it fights." Petrov nodded, knowing the truth had just begun to dawn. Smoke still drifted across the battlefield when orders came down from Divisional HQ. The Soviets were to pursue the retreating German armor toward the forests north of Berdikiv. No rest. No time to clean soot from faces or scrape congealed mud from the tracks. Engines rumbled back to life, coughing diesel fumes into the cold air. Men moved like shadows, exhausted but wired, hearts still pounding from the clash. The pursuit began at dusk. A striped sky stretched overhead, violet melting into red as artillery thumped in the distance. The forest smelled of pine sap and churned soil. Morozov's T-34 led the vanguard, its headlight shutters barely open. The tank felt more like a living creature than a machine now, a stubborn beast that refused to die. Inside, the crew worked in a rhythm forged by fire. Pavel gripped the levers with knuckles scabbed raw. "Transmission's holding," he said, surprised. The clutch groaned but did not fail. Fedya loaded shells by feel, alone, murmuring under his breath. Nikolai tapped the side of the radio when signals crackled into static. "We're outpacing command," he muttered, again. Morozov kept one eye pressed to the periscope, the world appearing through a fogged rectangle that smeared the trees into a watercolor. "We stay on them," he said quietly. Behind him, Lieutenant Petrov rode in a supply truck, watching the T-34s ahead carve a path through ruts and roots. He had spent months hearing that Soviet armor doctrine was outdated, that the Germans had mastered mobile warfare. But now, in the fading light, he saw something different. The T-34s moved with an ugly, improvised grace. They were not delicate machines. They were freight trains with cannons. The column slowed as scouts returned with urgent gestures. German armor had regrouped near a ruined tractor depot. A small but formidable rear guard, Panzer-IV, supported by anti-tank guns dug into camouflaged nests. Morozov swung his turret and studied the silhouettes between the trees. "They want to delay us," he said. "Break our momentum." Petrov climbed onto the back of the turret. "Then we break theirs?" The assault began without ceremony. No grand speeches, no polished formations. The first T-34s advanced directly through thickets that a German tank would never dare enter. Twigs snapped against their hulls. Branches dragged across turrets with wooden shrieks. The Germans hadn't expected armor to come through forest cover this thick. But Soviet crews had discovered something. The T-34's Christie suspension, brutally simple and absurdly rugged, let it bounce over obstacles that would cripple lighter vehicles. A German 75mm gun fired. The shot ripped past Morozov's turret, tearing bark from a tree. Another slammed into a nearby T-34's side, denting the armor in a crater, but failing to penetrate. The crew inside flinched, then responded with a thunderous return shot that silenced the gun crew instantly. In the depot clearing, 2 Panzer-IVs began to reverse, their engines whining. They fired quick, desperate salvos that cracked the air like bone. One shell hit Morozov's hull at an angle, ricocheting into the sky with a shriek. Another lodged itself into the slope without punching through, leaving a smoking crater. Inside, Fedya shouted, "Hit or miss, decide." Morozov steadied his breath. The periscope blurred again. He wiped it, blinked twice, and fired. The T-34's gun barked. The blast illuminated the tree line. The shell struck the first Panzer-IV on the lower plate. The tank jolted, then slumped like a toppled statue as flames crawled along the seams. German infantry scrambled from trenches, firing Panzerbuchse rifles that pinged harmlessly off the hulls. Soviet machine gunners returned fire from hatches, their bullets cutting through the twilight. Petrov sprinted through the underbrush, directing infantry forward, shouting orders over the noise. He ducked behind a fallen beam as a German shell detonated nearby, showering him in splinters. "Advance! Keep the armor moving!" he yelled, voice hoarse. The T-34s obeyed like blunt instruments of fate. They lumbered over a collapsed wall, crushing bricks beneath their tracks. They smashed through a line of crates hiding a field gun. They advanced even when vision blurred and shockwaves rattled the rivets loose. By nightfall, the Germans were in full retreat. This time not a planned, organized withdrawal, but a harried flight into the deeper forest. Their rear guard had been shattered by machines they'd underestimated. Machines they'd assumed were too crude, too unsophisticated, too primitive to stand toe-to-toe with German engineering. Morozov's crew dismounted near the burning depot. The night wind pulled smoke sideways, revealing the broken silhouettes of Panzer-IVs still glowing red-hot. Sparks drifted upward like fireflies. Captain Sokolov approached, wiping soot from his brow. He studied the nearest T-34. the same tank he had mocked for rough welds and farmer's optics. His eyes lingered on the dents where German shells had failed. "It shouldn't work," Sokolov said quietly. "Not like this." Petrov answered, "It works because it has to." Fedya slid down from the turret, face streaked with grime. "Let the Germans polish their machines," he said, kicking a loose track pin back into place. "Ours just keeps going." Morozov rested a hand on the sloped armor, feeling the warmth radiating from within. The tank ticked softly, metal contracting after battle, like a beast cooling its blood. Tomorrow they would fight again. Tomorrow there would be more doubts, more dents, more enemy fire. But tonight, beneath the smoke-stained stars, one truth settled over them like falling ash. The T-34 was not merely surviving, it was becoming the Red Army's hammer, the machine that refused to die. The first snow fell hard that November, sweeping across the Ukrainian plains in thick, gusting curtains. It buried shell craters, softened the outlines of burned-out farmhouses, and turned the battlefield into a white desert where sound carried strangely, muffled one moment, amplified the next. By dawn, the temperature had plunged below 20 degrees. It was the kind of cold that punished every moving thing. But machines, especially German ones, suffered most. Lieutenant Petrov marched at the head of an infantry column toward a new assembly position near Izium. Thin ice crackled underfoot. Snow clung to the great hulks of the waiting T-34s, turning them into white beasts, crouched in silence. Men scraped frost from their eyelashes, breath fogging into halos before being torn away by the wind. Inside Morozov's tank, the crew fought winter as fiercely as they fought the Germans. Pavel hammered a stiffened lever with his palm. "Transmission's stiff," he muttered, "but she'll warm up." He wrapped a greasy blanket around the gearbox, a trick taught by an old mechanic who said heat should be stolen, not waited for. Fedya's fingers were numb through his gloves as he loaded shells into the rack. "My hands feel like wood," he grumbled. "Wood loads shells just fine," Morozov replied, rubbing frost off the periscope. Again, Nikolai adjusted the radio, banging on the side panel to persuade it back to life. The static snapped sharply, then settled into a faint hum. "Good enough," he whispered, though his lips cracked from the cold. Petrov climbed onto the turret and peered down. The metal was so frigid it burned the skin if touched too long. "Morozov, your company is leading the breakthrough tomorrow," he said. "Intelligence reports heavy German armor near the river crossings, possibly new Panzer IV F2s." The words hung in the air. The F2 variant carried a long-barreled 75mm gun, a weapon capable of piercing the T-34's armor at long range. An equalizer? Morozov nodded slowly. "Then we close the distance," he said. "If they want range, we take it away." Petrov looked over the snow-covered field. "And if they hit us before we get close?" Morozov didn't hesitate. "Then we hope the angles save us." The angles, those same slopes they had once mocked. The next morning, the offensive began at first snowlight. Petrov climbed onto the turret and peered down. The metal was so frigid it burned the skin if touched too long. "Morozov, your company is leading the breakthrough tomorrow," he said. "Intelligence reports heavy German armor near the river crossings, possibly new Panzer IV F2s." The words hung in the air. The F2 variant carried a long-barreled 75mm gun, a weapon capable of piercing the T-34's armor at long range. An equalizer? Morozov nodded slowly. "Then we close the distance," he said. "If they want range, we take it away." Petrov looked over the snow-covered field. "And if they hit us before we get close?" Morozov didn't hesitate. "Then we hope the angles save us." The angles, those same slopes they had once mocked. The next morning, the offensive began at first snowlight. T-34 engines growled to life, deep, steady, and pulsing with diesel heat. German engines, in contrast, stuttered and wheezed across the lines. Reports came in of Panzer III's failing to start, of engines cracking from frozen coolant, of lubricants thickening into useless glue. Soviet diesel didn't freeze so easily. Soviet designs didn't rely on delicate systems that cracked under stress. For once, the crudeness that had drawn scorn became an advantage sharper than steel. Morozov's tank led the charge across a frost-bitten plain littered with frozen wheat. Snow plumed behind the advancing line as dozens of T-34s surged forward like white ghosts. Petrov, riding in a trailing vehicle, saw the German positions first, dark shapes against the riverbank. Muzzle flashes stuttered from among them. The opening German shells were terrifying in their precision. A long-barreled Panzer IV scored a direct hit on a distant T-34, punching through its frontal armor in a single clean strike. The tank erupted into fire, snow melting violently around it. The crews recoiled at the sight. This was a new threat. "Panzer IV F2, Petrov murmured. "They've brought their best." Morozov didn't break stride. Pavel kept the tank weaving slightly, never giving the Germans a clean target. Snowflakes blurred past the periscope in streaks. The world shrank to white, smoke and the thunder of incoming fire. Another German shell screamed overhead and detonated behind them, showering snow into the air like a geyser. "We close the gap," Morozov ordered. "Keep speed." The T-34s accelerated. Their wide tracks bit into the snow like claws, gripping when German tanks spun helplessly. The Soviets roared forward, engines howling, silhouettes dancing between puffs of smoke. A Panzer IV fired directly at Morozov's tank. The shell struck the glacis plate at an oblique angle. A sharp clang, a spray of sparks, but no penetration. Inside, the crew sat stunned for half a breath. Fedya broke the silence. "Still alive," he whispered. Morozov responded with a single focused command. "Return fire." Fedya slammed a shell home. Morozov lined up the target through frost-streaked optics and pulled the trigger. The T-34's gun blasted white smoke into the freezing air. The shell streaked across the riverbank and slammed into the Panzer's turret, punching through. The turret peeled open like a tin toy. Cheers erupted through the intercom. Nearby, another T-34 crushed an anti-tank gun under its tracks, splintering the wooden carriage. Soviet infantry rushed past, firing into trenches, bayonets fixed. It was chaos, brutal, decisive chaos. And the T-34 thrived in it. German soldiers attempted to pull back across the frozen river, but the ice cracked under the retreating vehicles. One Panzer sank halfway, crew scrambling out as icy water swallowed their machine. Petrov watched it all unfold and felt the shape of a realization forming, sharp and undeniable. The Germans still had better optics, better crew training, better command structure, even, in some ways, better precision engineering. But war wasn't a laboratory. War was mud, cold, fire, shock, movement, improvisation. War punished fragility, no matter how beautiful its welds. As the battle wound down, Morozov's tank rolled to a halt near the riverbank. Steam drifted from its engine deck, mingling with breath-shaped clouds of the crew clambering out, exhausted but intact. Petrov approached slowly. "What do you think now, Morozov?" he asked. Morozov looked over the battlefield. Burning panzers, broken ice, retreating Germans. Then he patted the sloped armor of his tank. "I think simplicity," he said, "is a weapon." Winter loosened its grip by early March, leaving behind a landscape carved by tank tracks and thawing bodies of ice. Mud returned first, thick, clinging mud like wet cement, sucking, at boots and swallowing. Entire helmets lost days earlier. The T-34s wore it like armor. Their hulls streaked brown and black, engines gummed with sludge that technicians scraped off with shovels. The battalion was ordered back to Kharkiv for refit and replenishment. Rumor spread quickly through the ranks. New reinforcements were arriving straight from factories farther east, tank plants. Evacuated piece by piece, rebuilt behind the Urals, now spitting out T-34s by the dozens every day. Petrov arrived at the rail depot just as the first train screeched in, brakes wailing like wounded steel. Flat cars rolled past, carrying lines of fresh T-34s, unpainted steel still smelling of factory heat, weld seams dark and rough. Standing beside him, Captain Sokolov stared in disbelief. "Look at those welds," he said, shaking his head. "Crooked, uneven." Petrov nodded. "And yet, each one is a gun, an engine, and armor. And we have dozens. Hundreds soon." Sokolov sighed, the sound half frustration, half awe. "The Germans can't match this." The war unloading began with shouts and rattling chains. Workers from the factory, some barely older than schoolboys, others grandmothers with scarves tied tight, guided the machines off the rail cars. They moved with practiced rhythm, as if building tanks had become a new national language. Morozov arrived moments later, his crew trotting behind him with bags of tools and spare parts. His eyes locked on the rows of new T-34s. "Beautiful," he murmured. Pavel laughed. "Beautiful? They look like they were welded by blind men." "And yet," Morozov said, patting the first hull affectionately, "each one will live longer than any of us." Inside the maintenance yard, older T-34s were stripped and repaired, engines removed, track pins knocked loose, armor plates hammered back into shape with mallets. Mechanics moved among the machines with the reverence of battlefield surgeons. Petrov watched Morozov's crew working. They had changed since the summer, shoulders broader, movement surer, jokes rarer. The war had carved them like chisels shaping stone. Fedya replaced cracked periscope glass on their original tank. "Maybe now," he said, "I'll actually see what I'm shooting at." Nikolai snorted. "Don't get cocky. Clarity is dangerous." Pavel slid out from beneath the hull, grease smear across his cheek. "Engine's tired," he said, "but I can coax a few more fights out of her." Morozov shook his head. "Not this time. Command wants us in a new machine for the spring offensive." Fedya's brow furrowed. "We're leaving her behind?" Morozov rested a hand on the battered hull. Scars from ricochets peppered the slope. Weld repairs streaked like old wounds. "She carried us through hell," he said softly. "But the war is growing. We need a tank that hasn't yet spent its luck." They stood in silence a moment. Then the next train whistle blew. By the time reinforcements were fully assembled, the division's tank park looked like something out of a nightmare. Or a dream, depending on the flag you served. Dozens upon dozens of T-34s, their green paint still wet, engines coughing life into the damp air. Petrov climbed one of the new tanks and scanned the horizon. A forest of exhaust plumes rose across the steppe, each one marking a new fighting machine. The scale was overwhelming. This was no longer a handful of tanks holding a defensive line. This was an armored wave. A blunt, unstoppable surge of steel born not from perfection, but from necessity. Sokolov joined him on the turret. "I used to think quality would win this war," he said. "Precision. Clean seams. Clear optics." "Quality helps," Petrov replied. "But this..." He swept his arm over the endless rows. "This is something else." "Quantity?" Sokolov asked. "No," Petrov said. "Endurance, in the distance." Morozov led his crew to their new assignment, T-34 number 381, still smelling of fresh paint. Its armor plates looked even rougher than their old tanks. Welds jagged like lightning strikes. Pavel touched the armor and nodded. "Good seams," he said. Fedya blinked. "What? What's good about these?" Pavel shrugged. "They held for the last one. That's good enough." Morozov climbed into the commander's hatch, looked around at his battalion, at the fields, at the assembly of Soviet industry made manifest in steel, and felt a new kind of certainty settle over him. "We're not just fighting with tanks anymore," he said quietly over the intercom, as the engine roared awake. "We're fighting with a nation's heartbeat." Petrov watched tanky 381 roll forward to join the growing formation. Engines growled. Tracks churned mud. Flags lifted in the cold wind. This was the moment the Red Army had something the Germans could never reclaim. Not time, not fuel, not material. Momentum, 1,000 simple machines beating in unison. 1,000 angles that turned aside death. 1,000 engines that started in the cold. And men who had learned not to mock simplicity, but to trust it. Tomorrow the offensive would begin. Tomorrow the T-34 would show the world what mass-produced resilience looked like. Dawn crept over the fields west of Prokhorovka on July 12, 1943, casting long shadows over the wheat. The earth trembled beneath thousands of engines. Dust drifted in sheets across the steppe, turning the rising sun into a dull orange disk. It was the largest armored clash the world had ever seen, and would ever see. Morozov stood in the open hatch of T-34 number 381, goggles dusted yellow, scarf snapping in the warm summer wind. Pavel tightened his grip on the driver's levers. Fedya whispered to the shell he held as if it were a prayer. Nikolai tapped the radio in steady rhythm, clearing static with each hit. Petrov approached the tank on foot, boots kicking up dust. His tunic was soaked through with sweat. He leaned close to Morozov. "The Germans are coming straight at us," he said. "SS Panzer divisions, Tigers and Panthers leading the spearhead." Morozov lowered his goggles. "Then today we stop giants." A distant roar rose behind him, the sound of hundreds of T-34 engines idling, rumbling like an approaching storm. Ahead, the horizon flickered with gun flashes. The Germans were advancing in dense formations, Tigers lumbering forward like iron fortresses, Panthers sleek and predatory. Their long-barreled guns were murderously accurate at range, but range would not matter today. "Orders from Corps Command," Nikolai shouted from inside the turret. "We charge. Close distance at all costs." The word charge echoed through the battalion like a spark dropped into fuel. Morozov slammed the hatch shut. "Pavel, full speed, no looking back." The T-34 lurched forward. The Soviet line surged across the wheat fields, engines screaming, treads ripping golden waves through the stalks. Dust enveloped the advancing horde until they looked less like machines and more like a single massive creature rising from the earth. German shells landed first. Precise, powerful, devastating. A Tiger's round punched clean through a T-34 to Morozov's left, sending its turret catapulting skyward. Another T-34 burst into flames before its crew could bail out. But the charge did not slow. It grew. The thunder of Soviet engines swallowed fear, swallowed hesitation, swallowed doubt. Inside Morozov's tank, the world became vibration and heat. Shells screamed past. The hull rattled. The periscope blurred. The wheat parted like water. Fedya shouted, 200 meters! Panther cresting on the right ridge. Morozov saw only shadows and dust through his smeared optics. "We get closer," he ordered. "Closer!" German long-range accuracy meant nothing at point-blank distance, and the T-34s were built for teeth-to-teeth brawling. For chaos, mud, smoke, and shock. 2 T-34s smashed into the flank of the German line, ramming a Tiger and forcing it to pivot awkwardly. Infantry followed behind, diving into shell craters as machine guns hammered the fields. Petrov rode in a command truck behind the line, binoculars pinned to his eyes. He saw the Soviet tanks spilling into the German formation like a flood bursting through a dam. "God help them," Sokolov muttered beside him. "They won't know what hit them." Morozov's T-34 broke through the dust cloud and into open sight of a Panther bearing down on them. The German gun barked, a bright flash, a shriek. The shell slammed into the T-34's upper hull and ricocheted. The tank rocked violently. Sparks showered the air inside. Fedya cursed and dropped a shell on his foot. Pavel fought the controls, knuckles white. "That was luck," Nikolai breathed. Morozov wiped the periscope with his sleeve. No, he said. That was Slope. He fired. The T-34's gun roared. The shell struck the Panther under its turret ring. Armor split. Flames erupted. Fedya loaded again, hands trembling but fast. They barreled forward, dodging craters, weaving between burning wrecks. A Tiger appeared through the haze, massive, implacable, its cannon already turning toward them. "Brace!" Morozov shouted. The Tiger fired. The ground exploded beside them, throwing the T-34 sideways. Pavel struggled to straighten the tank, mud spraying in arcs. Morozov steadied his breath, aimed as best he could with shaking optics, and fired again. The shell hit the Tiger's track. A thunderous crack. Steel links burst apart. The giant lurched, stalled, and twisted like a wounded animal. "Hit again," Morozov yelled. Fedya rammed another shell home so hard he tore skin from his knuckles. The second round slammed into the Tiger's hull. Flames and smoke poured from its vents. The massive tank went still. Hours later, the battlefield burned under the afternoon sun. Wrecked Tigers smoldered. Panther hulls lay canted in the fields. Dozens of T-34s were gone, melted steel and silent turrets marking their graves, but dozens more still ran, and more were rolling in behind them. Petrov found Morozov's tank near a scorched hedgerow. The crew sat on the hull, drinking from canteens, faces blackened with soot, hands shaking from adrenaline and exhaustion. Petrov climbed onto the turret. "You broke them," he said. Morozov shrugged. "We survived them." "That's enough," Petrov replied quietly. "That's how wars turn." He looked across the steppe, a graveyard of German engineering, a broken wall of precision machines crushed under speed, numbers, and ruthless simplicity. This was not the victory of a perfect tank. This was the victory of a good enough tank made in unstoppable quantity, easy to fix, simple to drive, and built for the real world, not the drawing board. The T-34 had outlived every German machine on this field, and it would outlive many more. The smoke of Prokhorovka lingered in the sky for days, a gray veil that drifted over scorched wheat and shattered armor. By July 16th, the battlefield had settled into an eerie quiet, a silence so total it seemed to swallow sound itself. T-34s rolled slowly through the wreckage, their engines grumbling low, like predators sniffing for signs of life among the ruins. Petrov rode atop Morozov's tank, boots dangling over the glacis, scanning the fields with a dull ache behind his eyes. The smell of burned fuel clung to everything. Skin, uniforms, even the water in their canteens tasted faintly of smoke. The steppe wind carried it for miles. "Hard to believe anyone walked away from this," Petrov said. Morozov nodded from the hatch. "Hard to believe we did." Below them, Pavel steered around the skeletal husk of a Tiger. Its turret lay upside down, blown clean off by an internal explosion. Fedya whistled. "German craftsmanship," he said with a wry grin. "Precise, clean, very flammable." Nikolai snorted. "If they built fewer, maybe they'd last longer." Morozov didn't laugh. His eyes lingered on the field, on the dozens of T-34s that would never roar again, their hulls blackened, their turrets warped like melted candles. "We lost too many," he murmured. Petrov placed a hand on the turret. "But we could lose many, that's the difference." Behind them, a convoy of fresh T-34s approached. Engines new, paint bright, tracks still unscarred. Another wave, another heartbeat of the Soviet war machine pulsing across the steppe. Morozov watched them arrive with a strange mix of pride and solemnity. "They keep coming," he said softly. "Just like us." Weeks passed, and the Red Army pressed westward. Villages liberated, rail lines retaken, grain fields reclaimed. Every river crossing and every forest road echoed with the rumble of T-34 tracks. Sometimes a tank would pass by a farmhouse, and children would emerge, faces thin but eyes wide. They touched the armor as if touching a myth. But for the crews inside, the war never softened. The roads were rough, the heat unbearable, the dust relentless. Engines overheated, tracks snapped. The simple machines still demanded simple sacrifices. One blazing afternoon near Poltava, Morozov's tank sputtered and coughed. Pavel thumped the engine panel. "She's cooking," he warned. "If we push harder, we lose her." Morozov ordered a halt under a sparse line of birch trees. The crew spilled out, drenched in sweat, collapsing onto the ground. Steam hissed from the engine vents. Fedya lay on his back, arms spread, muttering curses at the sky. "These new tanks may look fresh," he said, "but they still break like the old ones." Petrov approached with a map rolled under his arm. "Front line's shifting. We move north by dusk. Can you get her running?" Pavel nodded. "Give me 2 hours with a wrench, a rag, and maybe a prayer." Petrov smiled faintly. "The prayer is optional." As Pavel worked, Morozov watched the horizon. Dust plumes rose in the distance. Soviet supply columns bringing fuel, ammunition, spare parts, food. Endless caravans feeding endless machines. "What do the Germans see when they look at us?" Morozov wondered aloud. Petrov sat beside him. "They see what we used to mock." "A crude tank?" Morozov asked. Petrov shook his head. "No, a tank that does not stop." By autumn, the Red Army crossed the Dnieper. It was not an elegant campaign. The crossings were chaotic and bloody. marked by hastily built pontoons, boats riddled with bullets, and tanks firing from riverbanks shrouded in smoke. The T-34s didn't glide across. They slogged, shoved, and clawed their way to the far side. On one crossing, German artillery hammered the shoreline. Shells burst in fountains of mud and water. A T-34 attempted to ford the shallow edge of the river, but slipped sideways, water flooding its exhaust. The crew bailed out under fire, swimming through icy water as bullets snapped overhead. Morozov's tank provided cover, gun booming again and again. Fedya's hands shook from the cold, but he loaded without pause. Pavel cursed the mud, the water, the world, and pushed the tank forward meter by meter. When the far bank was secured, Petrov found Morozov sitting alone beside the tank, boots soaked, uniform torn. "Another day, another miracle," Petrov said. Morozov didn't look up. "Tell me, Petrov, how many more?" Petrov lowered himself onto a crate. "Enough until the Germans run out of miracles of their own." Morozov rubbed the sloped armor beside him, scarred, dented, battered again, but still whole. "She's ugly," he said. "She's perfect," Petrov answered. By winter's first frost, the truth was undeniable on every front. The T-34 had become the backbone of an army that refused to break. It wasn't the best tank in the world. It wasn't the strongest. It wasn't the most accurate. But it was the tank that existed everywhere. In every village, every field, every front line. A machine that matched the scale of the war itself. For every German tank knocked out, 2 more T-34s arrived. For every hull lost, 3 more rolled from factories. For every crew that fell, another took their place. Not because the machine was elegant, not because it was flawless, but because it endured, and because the men inside it had learned to endure with it. Snowmelt pooled in the streets of Warsaw as the Red Army thundered through in January 1945. Tanks rolled past shattered buildings and burned out trams, their engines echoing down boulevards marked by rubble and rifle cracks. The war had shifted westward, and Morozov's battalion, what remained of it, had followed every kilometer of that march. Now the road ahead pointed toward the heart of the Reich, toward Berlin. Petrov rode beside the column in an open staff car, collar turned up against the cold wind. The city sprawled behind him in ruins, but the soldiers lining the sidewalks cheered as the T-34s passed. One boy, no older than 10, placed a small Soviet flag on the hull of Morozov's tank as it rumbled by. Morozov saluted the boy with a nod. Fedya stuck his head out of the turret hatch and shouted, "We'll give them hell for you!" Pavel, from the driver's seat, grinned. "We've been giving them hell since Khmelnytsky." Nikolai thumped the radio. And the radio still works, mostly. Morozov scanned the horizon ahead. The front was close, too close. Artillery thumped in the far distance, rattling window frames. Smoke drifted above the ruined skyline, black and oily. Petrov's vehicle pulled alongside. "Orders are in," he called. "We cut south, cross the Oder by Kustrin, and push through their last defensive belt." Morozov nodded. "The Germans won't give ground easily." "They can't afford to," Petrov replied. "But neither can we." 2 weeks later, the battalion reached the Oder. The crossing was chaos, thunderous, freezing, frantic. German artillery hammered the far bank. Water thrashed violently from each impact. Pontoon bridges groaned under the weight of armor. On the near bank, engines roared as T-34s formed a line, exhausts venting clouds of black smoke. Snowflakes hissed into steam as they touched the engine decks. "Morozov!" Petrov shouted over the noise. "Your company goes first. We need steel on the far side before they collapse the bridge." Morozov didn't hesitate. "Pavel, take us in." The T-34 lunged forward. Boards creaked. The entire bridge shuddered under the tank's weight. Fedya gripped the shell racks. Nikolai held the radio handset with white-knuckled intensity. Halfway across, German rounds found the bridge. Explosions tore planks free. Water surged upward in icy spray. A tank ahead slipped sideways and plunged into the river with a metallic scream. The crew scrambled out, limbs flailing, some vanishing beneath the waves. Morozov's teeth clenched. "Faster!" Pavel floored the throttle. The T-34 bounced hard enough to rattle bones, but it held, forcing its way forward until the tracks bit into solid earth on the far shore. They had made it. But the Germans were waiting. Machine gun fire scythed through the reeds. Mortars churned the mud. A Panzer IV, battered and painted in late war camouflage, fired from behind a barn. The shell struck Morozov's turret and ricocheted with a shriek. Inside, Fedya yelled, "That one rang my skull!" Morozov pivoted the turret, aimed, fired. The barn exploded into splinters. Flames tore upward as the Panzer collapsed into rubble. More T-34s surged across. Smoke blanketed the river. The Soviets pushed forward, inexorable, unstoppable, a tide of steel that refused to break. By the time they reached the outskirts of Berlin in April 1945, the world had narrowed to rubble and fire. Buildings stood like cracked teeth. Streets were trenches of broken brick. Nazi banners lay half buried in ash. Civilians fled in every direction, clutching children, dragging carts, wearing faces hollowed by years of war. The fighting was brutal. Every street, every courtyard, every basement window, German Panthers lurked behind collapsed walls, ambushing Soviet armor at terrifyingly close ranges. Anti-tank teams darted between ruins like ghosts, firing Panzerfausts that sent fountains of sparks and flame against T-34 hulls. On Königstrasse, Morozov's tank took a direct Panzerfaust hit against the side armor. Smoke poured into the driver's compartment. Pavel coughed violently, vision blurring. "We're fine," Morozov shouted, slamming the hatch shut. "We're fine, keep going." They were not fine, but the tank still moved. A Panther fired from the far end of the boulevard, its shot tearing open the pavement beside them. Morozov reacted fast. "Full speed! Close the distance!" Pavel gunned the engine. The T-34 roared down the street, weaving between burning trams and shattered storefronts. Fedya loaded another shell. Morozov fired, the recoil nearly throwing him against the turret wall. The shot missed high. The Panther fired again. This time, the shell struck the T-34's upper hull and bounced. "Angle saved us!" Nikolai shouted. Morozov steadied himself, wiped the periscope, aimed again. He fired. The shell punched through the Panther's turret. Flame erupted from its hatches. The German crew stumbled out and collapsed in the street. Berlin shook under the shock of the battle. By the end of April, the Reichstag loomed ahead, riddled with holes wrapped in smoke, swarming with Soviet infantry. T-34s rolled through the Tiergarten, their tracks crushing fallen statues and benches alike. Petrov arrived at Morozov's side as artillery thundered overhead. His uniform was torn, his hands blackened. "This is it," he said, "the end of the road." Morozov looked at his battered T-34, its armor pitted, its fenders twisted, its paint scorched away to bare metal. "We should have died 10 times over," he murmured. Pavel climbed out of the hatch, coughing smoke. "She kept us alive." Fedya leaned against the turret. Again and again. Nikolai thumped the radio softly. "Even this piece of junk still works." Petrov looked at all of them, exhausted, scarred, stubborn, and then at the tank that had carried them from Ukraine to Berlin. "This machine," he said quietly, "was never elegant, never refined, never perfect." Morozov nodded, but it outlasted everything. The wind carried the roar of Soviet troops storming the Reichstag. The war's end was minutes away. And, as the T-34 idled beneath a gray Berlin sky, its engine ticking like a tired heart, one truth settled over those who had survived inside it. Simplicity wasn't weakness. It wasn't crude. It wasn't inferior. It was endurance. And endurance had won the war.